Hello, everyone. Pastor George here. Wonderful for you to join me on this Wednesday where we're going to talk about Mark chapter 5, which is what we did in Bible study. Mark 5, why did I choose this? Well, there's actually three stories in this. We only read the second two, although the first one could easily be a part of what I wanted to talk about today. But like I've told you guys over the past few weeks, that kind of our theme for Lent is horror and Mark. And so I'm really looking at fear, passages that deal with fear and things like that. Um, Last week we looked at the calming of the sea. They get to the other side, to the Decapolis. Jesus there heals a man who has tons of demons in them called Legion. And then after he heals him, all the population is scared of Jesus, so they make him leave. Right that's the other fear story that's in chapter 5. So Jesus then leaves and goes back to the other side. So he's back in Galilee, and then these stories take place. Right. So, well, what happens? Well, Jesus is approached by one of the rulers of a synagogue, guy named Jairus. A ruler of a synagogue is probably not a rabbi. I think it would have said that, and this is a kind of a role. I think like maybe our equivalent might be like an elder or something. Someone who assists in the running of the synagogue. Maybe would help pick out Torah readings and things like that, right? So Jairus's daughter has died, and so he comes to Jesus and he says, "Heal her." Right? Uh, I guess she hasn't died yet. She dies later in the passage, and so Jesus, or she dies during it, and so Jesus goes to go with him. Well, on the way, as Jesus is walking, they run into, well, they're in a big crowd, and a woman sees Jesus, and she's been dealing with a medical condition over the past 12 years of her life. Something that's interesting to notice is that her condition has been lasting longer than Jairus' daughter was alive. So it's very kind of an interesting thing to think about. But anyway, she wants to be healed, and so she thinks to herself, if I touch him, I'll be healed. And she does. And she is healed. And Jesus then goes, who did this? Where is she? And then she comes before him and says that, she's scared. It's just kind of what I want to focus on. She's scared when she comes to approach Jesus, right? She doesn't know how he's going to react. And honestly, that's not an unintelligent thing to think, because while we might have a very image of Jesus in our minds that shows he's caring and loving and all these other types of things, which he is, right? If you were someone who was considered unclean, like this woman would have been, and you touched someone who was, they would become unclean too, and that is why she, is kind of an outcast and things like that. So she's probably worried that Jesus might weigh into her a little bit, right? But he tells her that her faith has made her well. And go in peace and be healed. But that's our first character that runs into Jesus, that we ran into Jesus and is afraid of him, which is an interesting thing to think about. Then they actually get to the ruler's house, and that's when we find out that his daughter is dead. And so, of course, the parents, you can imagine, are probably pretty upset by this. But Jesus tells them, and this is interesting, he says, "Do not fear, only believe." Again, getting at this idea of Mark and horror and fear, right? This idea that, do not fear what? Death? Do not fear, what is Jesus talking about? And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. This is the inner circle of the apostles. And they came to the house, and when he entered, he talks to them. He says, "Why are you weeping?" And they laugh at him. Something to note is in the Bible, when it says that people laugh, laughing is almost always negative. In fact, it's always negative as far as I'm aware in the Bible. In this time and place, if you were to show amusement, they had different ways of doing that. Both in the Old and New Testaments, laughing had kind of like a very negative connotation to it. Mocking, right? Mocking laughter. That's what they do to Jesus here. And Jesus sends everyone out, right? And they laugh at him because they think he's crazy or stupid or whatever else because he says the girl's only sleeping. Death is reversible for sleep, as reversible as sleep for Jesus, which shows a lot about his power, right? And then of course he raises this girl from the dead. He gives her something to eat. So this isn't just like a metaphorical raising from the dead, right? She walks, she eats. This is a pretty radical miracle that Jesus does here, right? And then he tells the people who were in the house, just his apostles, those three of them, and the family, to not say anything to anyone. And there's a lot of debate about why that is in biblical scholarship, but basically, my take is that Jesus does this so people do not start spreading false beliefs about him to other people, right? The idea that he's the Messiah, as I talked about on Sunday, I've talked about many times in the past, carries a lot of political connotations. Jesus doesn't want people to be thinking that about him. So he doesn't start like really talking about messianic claims in the Gospel of Mark in ways that we might understand them. He's constantly referring to himself as the Son of Man throughout Mark. So he is making claims, but he doesn't start admitting that he's the Messiah until very late into the book, and that's to show to get people to focus on who he is rather than what they think the Messiah should be. But before I end this, right, that ends chapter 5. So before I get through this, I want to really just think about the fear and trembling that the woman does and the fear of the people, right? Because why are they afraid? Well, the woman is afraid because she's worried that Jesus is going to do something to her. And that's partly because she knows that he's really powerful. Maybe in a lot of ways that other people do. So kind of the interesting thing is when he asks who touched him, the disciples say, "Hey, listen, we're in a crowd, dude. We're jostling into people all the time. Why could you say who touched me? We're always together." But it's just kind of this interesting thing where it's like being close physically to someone doesn't necessarily mean you're close spiritually. And the woman in this passage is the closest to Jesus spiritually, which means she understands what he's capable of. He didn't have to do any fancy tricks or anything, right? She just had to touch his clothes in faith and she was healed. And so she certainly is afraid for the reasons I stated earlier, the cultural and religious reasons, but she's probably also afraid because she knows that Jesus has this tremendously divine power and what he can do. And I think that should cause us to reflect. Do we really treat Jesus with the kind of respect or understanding of how powerful he really is? The second thing is when Jesus tells the parents not to fear when he comes to the house, right? Just believe. I mean, these stories are so interesting together because both of them have to do with faith, right? The woman has faith, so much faith she just touches Jesus' robes. The family has to be told, do not fear, just believe. And so the thing that is the killer of belief in Jesus's mind, or at least in this passage, is fear. But fear of what? I think that's kind of I would focus when I look at this, what are they afraid of? Well, they're afraid that their daughter's dead. Definitely. It's not a bad thing to be afraid about, right? But are they fearing the wrong thing? I think that's kind of the point that's in Mark. Mark doesn't necessarily say that fear is bad, especially if it's in relation to the appropriate thing, which is God and Jesus. But fear is a killer of faith when it is appropriated to other places, right? Or it's the opposite of faith when it's appropriated to other places, because death is not something to fear, right? You see that Jesus speak this way in other parts of Scripture, right? I think it's in the Gospel of Matthew, where he says, do not fear the one who can kill the body, but the one who can kill body and throw the soul into Hades, right? So the idea is like, who do you fear? And again, fear here has to do, yes, with literally being scared, but also, right, the right understanding. And it's scary because perceptions have changed and the human experience is de-centered. And so you see that again in these passages, because the point of these miracles is not to show, oh, good, look how good the healing is, or the fact that the girl's raised. It points to who Jesus is. And that's what's kind of scary for people. So that's what we talked about today. I hope you guys found that interesting. I will see you tomorrow for an episode of A New Thing. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and peace out.